I found 2 bran cakes in a dry waste bucket. My heart nearly stopped with joy. The cakes were coarse, the husks clearly visible, but the bucket wasn't too wet. They were relatively clean. I brushed off a couple of stray vegetable leaves and ignored the rotting stench coming from the bucket. I shoved the first cake into my mouth. It was cold and dry, like swallowing sawdust. Without any water, it stuck in my throat. I nearly choked, gasping for air as I forced it down. My stomach stopped growling, but I was still far from full. I had been in this world for 2 days. This was my first meal. As I caught my breath, I noticed a small boy standing in front of me. He was a beggar, maybe 10 years old, staring at the second cake in my hand with desperate, hungry eyes. I looked at the kid, then at the cake. I hesitated for a split second. Then, I moved the cake toward my own mouth. I wasn't sharing. I had transmigrated into this ancient-looking world only to find that my modern knowledge was useless. I could barely survive myself. I didn't have the luxury of pitying a stranger. The boy's face turned vicious. He lunged at me, jumping surprisingly high for someone so thin. His hands clawed for the cake, while his mouth dropped open, revealing yellowed teeth. He sank them deep into my forearm. I panicked for a moment, and then I saw red. Back in my old life, I wasn't a world beater, but I never went hungry. Now, I was stuck in this hellhole, and even a child thought he could rob me. My anger found a target. "Get off me." I swung my arm, slamming it into the boy's face. Blood sprayed from his nose. I expected him to fly back, but he was stubborn. He wrapped his arms around my limb and bit down even harder. He never took his eyes off the cake. The pain was sharp. My expression darkened. "You little animal," I hissed. "You want to bite me? I'll kill you." I brought my knee up with every ounce of strength I had, slamming it into his chest. That did it. He lost his grip and flew backward, landing hard on the filthy ground. I didn't stop there. I stepped forward and kicked him twice in the ribs, sending him sliding further away. He coughed up blood, clearly suffering from internal injuries. Only then did I pull back. I turned to leave, but I felt a chill. I looked back and saw the boy staring at me with a look of pure, cold hatred. It made my skin crawl. I was a newcomer here with no power and no background. Offending anyone was a mistake, even a beggar. Who knew if he belonged to some local gang? A dark thought crossed my mind. I needed to finish this. We were in a narrow, shadowed alley. No one was around. If I killed him now, no one would find out for hours. And even if they did, who would care about a dead beggar? In a lawless place like Yinxing, people died every day. The officials didn't have the time or the will to investigate. My eyes drifted to a heavy, smooth stone near the wall. It was hard, definitely harder than a child's skull. 2 days of misery boiled over. The modern morality I had lived by for 30 years shattered. My face twisted into something monstrous. I had seen enough violence in the last 48 hours to know that this was a world that ate people alive. Why should I play by the old rules? I started walking toward the stone. The boy's eyes finally filled with terror. Suddenly, 2 servants appeared at the mouth of the alley. They were carrying a large waste tub. The sight of outsiders snapped me out of it. My logic returned, and the monster inside me retreated. The opportunity was gone. I felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. I shook my head and walked out of the alley. The main street was a chaotic mess. People were sprinting toward the center of town. They were shouting about the Tiansha gang. They said the gang was hiring and that if you were late, you'd miss your chance. I had heard that name a lot lately. The Tiansha gang was the real power in Yinxing, often more influential than the government itself. They were known for being ruthless, but they had money. I followed the crowd, desperate for a way to earn a living. I didn't want to fight beggars for scraps anymore. I fought my way to the front of a wall where a notice was posted. The writing looked like traditional characters from my world. I could make out the gist of it. They were recruiting children between the ages of 7 and 12 to learn martial arts. They promised a bright future and a massive reward for the families of those chosen. I felt a wave of disappointment. I wasn't 7. In this body, I was 14 or 15. I didn't fit the criteria. I sighed and started to push my way out of the crowd. I needed to find another way. Suddenly, a loud, booming voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you, stop right there." I heard the shout, but I didn't think it was for me. I kept moving, trying to find a gap in the sea of people. "Kid, I'm talking to you." The shouting didn't stop. The voice behind me grew even more annoyed, asking if the name Lord Dog carried no weight in Yinching anymore. I was new to this place and terrified of offending the wrong person. I stopped in my tracks and turned around to see if he was actually talking to me. He was. A man with a thin, wispy mustache stood there, looking like a total street thug. He had two massive guys standing behind him, and all three of them wore the uniforms of the Tiansha gang. My stomach dropped. I had no idea how I'd managed to offend someone like him already. Back on Earth, I was just a regular salesman. I never made much money, but those years of grinding taught me one thing: how to read a room. I knew exactly how to talk to people, how to lie to their faces, and how to play whatever part was necessary to survive. I immediately forced a bright, admiring smile onto my face. I jogged over to him, bowing low and acting as humble as possible. "Lord Dog," I said, my voice dripping with fake respect. "You called for me? How can I serve you?" I hated acting like a servant, but I wasn't an idiot. In a world where the law didn't exist, you were either a powerful dragon or a dead fool. I wasn't about to get killed on my first day. Go Xing seemed satisfied with my groveling. The anger left his face, and he looked me up and down. "You can read?" he asked. I froze for a second. He must have seen me studying the recruitment notice earlier. I weighed my options. This guy was sharper than he looked, so lying was risky. I bowed even lower, making my smile look even more desperate. "Yes, Lord Dog. I spent a few years in a private school when I was younger. I know a few characters." The lie came out smoothly. Go Xing nodded, looking at me with something close to appreciation. Most scholars in this city were arrogant and looked down on gang members, even when they were starving to death. Seeing a literate person treat him with such respect in public clearly stroked his ego. He stood a little taller, trying to look important. "How old are you?" he asked. 16, I replied. I was actually younger, but I lied to make myself seem more useful. He asked for my name, and I told him it was Songwon. Then he asked how I made a living. I told him I wrote letters for people just to get by and that my parents were long gone. I painted myself as a lonely, desperate kid with nowhere to go. "Follow me from now on," Go Xing said. "I'll get you into the Tiansha gang. You'll get 1 silver tael a month as a salary." 1 silver tael was enough to feed a family for a month. It was a huge offer, but I hesitated. Why would a gang member be this nice to a stranger? Go Xing's face darkened instantly. "What? You think you're too good for the Tiansha gang?" I felt the threat in his voice and pivoted immediately. "No, Lord Dog. You misunderstand. I'm just worried my skills are too poor. I don't want to let you down." "I'm not worried. So why are you?" he barked. "Don't be ungrateful." I quickly shifted into a look of pure, overwhelming gratitude. I looked at him like he was my long-lost father. The worship in my eyes made him beam with pride. He reached into the coat of one of his thugs and pulled out half an oily pancake. "You look like you're starving," he said, tossing it to me. "Here, I didn't finish this from breakfast." "Thank you, Lord Dog. Thank you." I grabbed the pancake and started inhaling it. I was genuinely hungry, but I also wanted to keep feeding his ego. As I chewed, I realized something. If a gang leader was saving half-eaten scraps of bread, the Tiansha gang might not be as rich as people said. Still, it was a way out. Joining as a scholar meant I probably wouldn't be sent to the front lines to die in a street fight. It was the best chance I had. Go Xing finished his business at the recruitment wall and led me away. We walked through the city, passing through several layers of heavy security until we reached the Tiansha gang headquarters. It was a massive complex. We twisted through a maze of hallways until we reached a small room. Inside sat an old man named Yin Lao. He looked to be over 50, which was ancient for a place like this. He looked at me with cloudy eyes and tossed a small notebook onto the table. "Read it," he commanded. I knew this was my interview. I picked up the book and began to read the classic verses out loud. "Heaven and earth, dark and yellow. The universe, vast and waste." I had only read 100 characters or so when Yin Lao held up a hand. He looked at Go Xing and nodded. "You're in luck. Elder Ji-in is looking for literate young men. This kid fits the bill." Go Xing started rubbing his hands together, looking nervous for the first time. "Yin Lao, I heard the elder is offering a reward for finding scholars. Do I get a cut?" Yin Lao chuckled. "You're well-informed, kid. I thought you just got lucky, but you clearly went looking for him. Go to the accountant. You've earned 10 taels." Go Xing bowed and scraped, his face plastered with a sycophantic smile. I watched him from the side, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. Why was a literate man worth 10 taels of silver? In Yinxing, 10 taels could buy 2 pretty servant girls. A dark realization washed over me. I had been sold. Just moments ago, I was feeling smug, thinking I had played Go Xing for a fool. It turned out I was the idiot. As Go Xing turned to leave, I grabbed onto the last shred of hope I had left. Go Xing, you said you were going to take me to eat and drink the best food. I shouted. Go Xing glanced back at me. His eyes were cold, filled with nothing but mockery and contempt. He didn't say a single word. He just turned his back and vanished down the hallway. A little street rat like him couldn't give you a life of luxury. Yan Lao's icy voice drifted from behind me. Being sent to Elder Ji-in is a blessing most people would die for. It's a chance for immortality. Don't be ungrateful. He didn't wait for my response. Men, take this kid to Elder Ji-in. 2 massive guards stepped into the room. They were built like stone walls, with 3-foot steel sabers hanging from their waists. One of them drew his blade halfway. The cold gleam of the steel flashed in my eyes, making them sting. Kid, I suggest you stay quiet, the guard growled. Don't try anything stupid. Fury and resentment boiled inside me. Yan Lao called this a chance for immortality, but I wasn't a fool. If this was truly a blessing everyone envied, would they need to kidnap and force people into it? But looking at the sharp steel, I had no choice but to accept reality. In this world, the weak were just playthings for the strong. I followed them out, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. We walked for 15 minutes, deep into a secluded corner of the Tiansha gang headquarters. We reached a private courtyard tucked against the base of a mountain. Over 100 guards armed with sabers and crossbows stood watch. They were tall, expressionless, and radiated a suffocating pressure. Inside the courtyard, there were rows of simple wooden rooms. Behind them, at the foot of the mountain, stood a lone 2-story building. The land around it had been cleared into neat garden plots where strange, unknown herbs were growing. One of the guards pointed to the wooden rooms. Pick an empty one and stay inside. Food will be delivered 3 times a day. Do not come out until you are called. He stared at me, his eyes urging me to move. I picked a room at random and stepped inside. It was sparse, just a table, a chair, and a bed with some basic bedding. I closed the door and caught a glimpse of the guards leaving the courtyard. They weren't worried about me escaping. With a small army outside, there was nowhere to go. The moment the door clicked shut, my face twisted with rage. I had been suppressing my anger the whole way, but now it poured out. The arrogance of the Tiansha gang and my own helplessness felt like a weight on my chest. I craved power. Back at the tea house, I'd heard stories of warriors who could run on walls and fly over rooftops. Right then, I wished I was a master swordsman who could cut his way through this entire gang. I stayed locked in that room for 7 days. For the first 2 days, I paced like a caged animal, hating the feeling of being a fish on a chopping block. But the food was actually decent, meat and vegetables delivered right to my door. By the 3rd day, my mind started to settle. I realized the isolation was intentional. They wanted to break our spirits and make us realize how powerless we were before they moved to the next step. On the 8th day, a shout rang out across the courtyard. Everyone out of your rooms. Now, anyone who lingers will be punished. I heard doors banging open all down the line. I stepped out and saw about 100 other young men, all in their teens, standing in the courtyard. Most looked thin and terrified, huddled in small groups. They were locals from Yinxing, well aware of the Tiansha gang's reputation. They whispered complaints, glaring at the guards, but too afraid to speak up. Except for one kid. He was a chubby boy dressed in expensive silk, looking completely out of place among the rest of us. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. How dare you kidnap me? My father is Zhang the magistrate of Qingyuan County. Send me back this instant. Everyone turned to look. Qingyuan County was a major district under Yinxing. In this kingdom, a magistrate held real power. I wondered if the Tiansha gang had made a mistake or if this kid was just too spoiled to see the danger he was in. The guards looked hesitant, clearly annoyed by his constant yelling, but they didn't move. Then, a man stepped out from behind them. He was thin, in his 40s, with a sharp mustache. He looked at the screaming boy with pure boredom. He raised his right hand. Between his fingers was a slip of yellow paper. "Go," he whispered. The paper burst into ash. Suddenly, a fireball the size of a human head materialized in the air. The heat was terrifying, so intense the air around it seemed to warp and twist. With a violent whistle, the fire bolted across the yard. The fat boy's eyes widened with pure terror. He tried to turn and run, but the fireball slammed into his chest. The impact sent his heavy body flying backward into the air. He let out one piercing, blood-curdling scream before the flames engulfed him completely. He hadn't even hit the ground before he became a human torch. I heard the sickening sound of fat sizzling and popping. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Within seconds, the screaming stopped. By the time the fire died down, there was nothing left but a pile of ash. Not even a bone remained. Silence fell over the courtyard. 100 young men stood there, faces pale, too terrified to even breathe. I stood among them, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had lived 2 lives, but I had never seen anything like this. I was paralyzed by a mix of horror and awe. The Tian Sha gang was bolder than I thought. They had just executed the son of a high-ranking official in broad daylight. They clearly didn't give a damn about the imperial court or the 100 witnesses standing right here. But more than that, I was terrified by that man's power. That yellow slip of paper, the fireball, it wasn't martial arts. It looked exactly like the legends of cultivators from my old world. Was I actually in a world of immortals? While my mind raced, a voice broke the silence. "He's an immortal." A young man in tattered, patched-up clothes collapsed to his knees. His face was a mask of fear mixed with desperate longing. "He's an immortal," he screamed again. That cry snapped everyone out of their trance. One by one, the other young men dropped to the ground, bowing deeply toward the man with the mustache. His ruthless display of power had crushed any thought of rebellion. I didn't want to stand out, so I followed suit and knelt. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my chest. This was real power. This was far beyond the wandering swordsmen and martial artists I'd heard stories about. This was something greater. I stared at the ground, my resolve hardening. After days of being treated like trash and dragged around like cattle, I realized this was my chance. If I could obtain this power, I would never be at anyone's mercy again. I wouldn't be bullied. I wouldn't be a pawn. The man, who I now realized was the true master here, looked down at us. A smug, satisfied smile curled his lips. He had wanted to kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, and it had worked perfectly. He carried himself with an air of absolute control, looking at us like we were nothing more than insects. "I am a cultivator," he announced, his voice echoing. "You may call me Master Jean. I practice the orthodox Taoist arts, so you have nothing to fear. I have brought you here to grant you a great opportunity, a chance to seek immortality." The courtyard went silent. "For the next month, I will personally teach you the first layer of the longevity technique. Anyone who successfully senses and absorbs qi into their body within 30 days will become my personal disciple. Even if you don't achieve eternal life, you will gain power and wealth beyond your wildest dreams." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The terror was gone, replaced by burning greed and hope. Everyone stared at Master Jean with hungry eyes. I felt the excitement too, but a cold knot of suspicion stayed in my gut. It seemed too easy. This Jean was a master at manipulation. He hit us with a stick first, then offered a very shiny carrot. By terrifying us and then offering a way up, he ensured every single person here would work themselves to the bone for him. Nothing in this world is free. Why would a powerful immortal give away his secrets to a bunch of random kids? There had to be a catch. "Sit," Jean commanded. "Clear your minds. Calm your breathing." He began to explain the first layer of the longevity technique. He taught us how to sense the spiritual energy of the world and how to pull it into our bodies. To my surprise, he was an excellent teacher. He went through the manual word by word, adding his own insights and experiences. Most of the guys were literate, a rarity in this era, so they followed along easily. Some were so impatient they closed their eyes and tried to cultivate right then and there. I didn't rush. I listened to every single word he said. I knew that sharpening the axe doesn't delay the woodcutting. Besides, sensing qi wasn't something you just did in 5 minutes. 2 hours passed quickly. Jean stood up and smoothed his robes. "That is enough for today. Spend your time reflecting. I will return for 1 hour every day to guide you. For this month, you are forbidden from leaving this estate, but you may move freely within the walls. Food will be provided. Do not disappoint me." With that, he vanished toward the back of the property. The Tian Sha guards moved in, handing each of us a small booklet containing the text of the first layer. The courtyard erupted into hushed, frantic conversations. Some ran back to their rooms to practice in private, while others huddled in groups to debate the meanings of the verses. I stayed quiet and walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jean was being too helpful. When someone shows unnecessary kindness, they're either a saint or a thief, my old man used to say. And Jean definitely wasn't a saint. I took the opportunity to scout the estate. It was massive, built right against the side of a mountain. The area where we stayed was just a small corner of the grounds. Behind our rooms was a large open space with ponds and trees. Further back, at the foot of the mountain, stood a 2-story building. I guess that was Jean's private residence. Surrounding it were neat rows of gardens filled with strange, medicinal herbs. After getting the layout down, I went to my room. A meal was already waiting on the table: 3 white flour buns and a plate of stir-fried vegetables with actual pieces of meat. In this kingdom, this was a feast. Most commoners would kill for a meal like this. The better the treatment, the more uneasy I felt. It felt like we were being fattened up for something. I ate quickly and pulled out the booklet. The text was short, barely 100 words, but the language was incredibly dense and cryptic. Without Jean's lecture, it would have taken me months just to decode the first sentence. I spent an hour memorizing every character until I could recite it backward. Then, I sat on my bed, crossed my legs, and held my breath. I focused my mind, repeating the mantras, trying to feel even a spark of that spiritual energy Jean talked about. 2 hours passed. Then 3. Nothing. I felt absolutely nothing. I opened my eyes, a bead of sweat rolling down my forehead. A dark thought crossed my mind. Did I simply have no talent for this? Was my talent just that bad? I spent the entire afternoon practicing, but I made 0 progress. Doubt started to sink in. During his lecture, Jean mentioned that not everyone has the spiritual root required for cultivation. In fact, it was rare, maybe 1 in 100 people possessed it. Even among those who did, their levels of talent varied wildly. Jean hadn't gone into much detail about it. He had been vague, almost as if his own knowledge on the subject was limited. I opened my door and stepped out, feeling a heavy sense of disappointment. It was evening. The sky was a brilliant, shimmering gold, painted by the setting sun. It was beautiful, but I was in no mood to enjoy the view. I was trapped in a dangerous situation, and my only way out was failing. I saw a group of young men gathered in the courtyard, whispering and comparing notes. I wandered over, ears open, trying to gauge where everyone else stood. After a quick lap around the grounds, my heart finally settled. Out of over 100 people, not a single one had sensed the spiritual energy yet. It turned out that becoming an immortal wasn't that easy. After a quick dinner, I went straight back to my room. I practiced late into the night, pushing myself until the early hours of the morning. Still, I felt nothing. Exhausted and frustrated, I finally collapsed into bed and fell asleep. The next morning, Jean appeared outside the wings right on schedule. "Did anyone sense the spiritual energy yesterday?" he asked. Silence. Not a single person stepped forward. Jean didn't seem disappointed. He simply began his lecture again, patiently explaining the key points of the longevity art. Time blurred. By the night of the 3rd day, everything changed. I was sitting in my usual cross-legged position when I finally felt it. My eyes were closed, but I could see countless tiny, shimmering sparks of light floating in the air around me. They drifted aimlessly, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. I was exhausted, but this sight jolted me awake. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had done it. I had taken the first step on the path to cultivation. This meant I had the talent. I had a chance to become one of those legendary immortals everyone envied. I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't get ahead of myself. I tried to take it a step further, to pull those sparks into my body. I tried for 15 minutes. I focused all my will on the lights, but they wouldn't budge. They ignored me, floating just out of reach. Then, a cold realization hit me. I stopped. I couldn't succeed too quickly. At the very least, I couldn't be the first one to do it. Until I knew exactly why Jean was teaching us this, I had to hide my progress. Showing off my talent might just put a target on my back. The next morning, we gathered outside again. Jean asked the same question. Did anyone sense the spiritual energy yesterday? He waited. No one spoke. After a moment, Jean withdrew his gaze, looking slightly disappointed. It had been 3 days, and still nothing. I kept my face blank, blending into the crowd. If I was the only one who had sensed it, it meant my talent was actually quite good, better than the 100 other people here, at least. That night, I pushed further. I focused on a single spark and guided it. Finally, the first wisp of spiritual energy entered my body. A faint, warm current appeared in my meridians. It followed the path of the longevity art, flowing through me like a gentle stream. My eyes snapped open. I wanted to keep going, to drink in as much as I could, but another dark thought stopped me. What if Jean could sense my cultivation level? If he found out I had succeeded and lied to him, I'd be dead. I immediately cut off the technique. The spiritual energy that had been gathered around me scattered instantly. The wisp inside my body, which hadn't been fully refined yet, slowly leaked back out into the air. That was close. I decided to stop practicing for the next few days. I would just go through the motions to keep up appearances. For days passed. On the morning of the 7th day, I stepped out of my room and heard a commotion. A group of young men had surrounded a guy named Ernyo. He was dark-skinned, thin but sturdy, and looked a bit slow-witted. Usually, he was the quiet type, but now everyone was looking at him with pure envy. Ernyo, did you really do it? Did you draw the energy in? Brother Ernyo, give us some tips. How did you do it? Ernyo's dark face turned a deep shade of red. He was a village boy, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. He looked proud but completely overwhelmed, stuttering as he tried to find the words. What is going on here? A harsh, booming voice cut through the chatter. Jean walked into the courtyard, his face twisted in anger. Why are you shouting instead of practicing? The crowd went silent. Everyone bowed their heads in fear. Since Ernyo was standing in the middle, Jean's eyes landed right on him. Ernyo began to tremble. Jean's gaze was predatory, like a wolf staring down a rabbit. Report, Great One. Ernyo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I succeeded last night. I drew the energy into my body. What? Jean's rage vanished instantly, replaced by pure joy. He lunged forward and grabbed Ernyo's wrist. After a few seconds of silence, a wide grin spread across his face. Well done, Ernyo. Excellent, Jean shouted. From today on, you are my first true disciple. After today's lesson, move your things into my private building. I will instruct you personally. Ernyo looked like he had just won the lottery. His eyes lit up with visions of a glorious future. Thank you, Great One. Don't call me Great One anymore, Jean said warmly. Call me Master. Jean patted Ernyo on the shoulder before turning to the rest of us. The rest of you work harder. If you succeed, you can also become my disciple and join Ernyo. Now, Ernyo, come sit by my side. As Jean began his lecture, I sat in the back, my mind racing. I began to piece things together. First, Jean's genuine shock proved he couldn't actually tell who had talent and who didn't. He was just casting a wide net, hoping to catch a few fish. Second, he couldn't sense cultivation from a distance. He had to touch Ernyo to confirm it. Third, and most concerning, Jean called Ernyo his first disciple. But from the way old Yin and the others talked, this wasn't the first time Jean had recruited a group like this. If there were others before us, where were they? Where were the ones who succeeded, and where were the ones who failed? Until I had those answers, I felt like a sword was hanging over my neck. But there was one silver lining. Now that I knew Jean couldn't monitor me from afar, I could finally practice in secret. 20 days passed in a flash. Another young man named Zhang Cheng managed to draw energy into his body. Jean was ecstatic. Out of over 100 recruits, having 2 people with cultivation talent was already a stroke of incredible luck. It had clearly exceeded Jean's expectations. During this time, I continued to practice in silence. The warm current inside my body grew stronger every day. As my cultivation progressed, my physical strength and mental clarity reached levels I never thought possible. While I couldn't exactly test my raw power in public, I felt incredibly sharp. My mind was quicker, and my senses were dialed in. I kept a close eye on Ernyo. His progress was obvious because he was too simple-minded to hide it. He loved showing off. Just yesterday, I watched him lift a massive stone weighing over 100 pounds with one hand. The crowd cheered and looked at him with pure envy. I did some quick math in my head. Based on how my body felt, I was definitely stronger than Ernyo. That meant my physical strength had already surpassed the 100-pound mark. I also kept waiting for Jean to do something sinister to the successful cultivators, but so far, nothing had happened. Every evening after dinner, I took a walk along the edges of the compound. It became a routine. At first, people looked at me strangely, but eventually, they stopped paying attention to the loner wandering by the walls. I wasn't just walking for exercise, though. I was scouting. I was memorizing every inch of the layout, looking for a way out if things turned south. The perimeter walls were over 10 feet high, too tall to climb quickly without being spotted. There were guards stationed everywhere, both inside and outside the walls. A direct escape seemed impossible. But after nearly a month of searching, I found something. About 100 yards from the dorms, hidden behind thick shrubs and tall weeds, there was a small hole at the base of the wall. A dog hole. It was just large enough for a person to crawl through. If I hadn't been looking so closely for days, I never would have spotted it. The problem was the guards nearby. Even if I got through the hole, I'd still be deep inside the Heaven Fiend gang's territory. I needed the perfect moment. With only 3 days left in the month, the atmosphere in the camp turned desperate. Dozens of young men crowded around Ernyo and Zhang Cheng, begging for the secret to drawing energy into their bodies. They were terrified of losing their one shot at becoming immortals. Ernyo and Zhang Cheng tried to help, but talent isn't something you can just explain. I stood near a large tree by the wall, watching the chaos. Nearby, 2 guards were leaning against the masonry, watching the desperate recruits with mocking eyes. "Look at those idiots," one guard sneered. "They're about to die and they don't even know it." The other guard sighed. "Poor kids. They're only 14 or 15. They don't understand how cruel the world is. There's no such thing as a free lunch." Their voices were low, but my enhanced hearing caught every word. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the talented ones Jean wanted. According to these guards, every single one of us was headed for a dead end, whether we succeeded in cultivation or not. It made sense. We had all learned the longevity art. If Jean let the failures go, the secret of his technique would leak out. He didn't want competition. He didn't want a bunch of random cultivators popping up in Yen City to threaten his power. I stayed hidden behind the tree until the guards moved on. I didn't wait to hear more. I slipped back to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to make a move. If I stayed a failure, I was dead in 3 days. If I succeeded, I might at least buy myself some time. The next morning, I stood with the group outside the dorms. Jean arrived late, a full half-hour past the usual time. Ernyo and Zhang Cheng followed behind him. When I saw Ernyo, I almost didn't recognize him. His steps were shaky. His spirit seemed drained. His skin was loose and sallow, as if he had aged 30 years in a single night. The vibrant young man was gone, replaced by someone who looked like an old man clinging to life. His face had an unnatural, feverish flush, like a sick patient who had been overdosed on potent medicine. Did he mess up his cultivation? Was he injured? I couldn't wrap my head around it, but it confirmed my fears. This master was dangerous. Still, I had to follow my plan. I stepped forward as Jean approached. "Master Jean," I said, bowing low. "Last night, I successfully drew energy into my body." Jean's eyes flashed with a golden light. He reached out and gripped my wrist instantly. I felt a surge of heat rush from his hand into my veins. It was the same type of spiritual energy I had cultivated, but Jean's was like a massive river compared to my small stream. I felt a pang of anxiety. I had been practicing for over 20 days. My energy was much stronger than a beginner's should be. I was terrified he'd realize I'd been lying to him. Fortunately, Jean didn't check too deeply. As soon as he felt the presence of spiritual energy, he withdrew his hand. He was probably afraid that his massive power would crush a newbie's fragile meridians. "Very good," Jean said, a look of genuine praise on his face. "What is your name?" "Song 1, I replied. "From today on, you are my 3rd disciple. Go sit with your senior brothers." "Thank you, master." I sat down next to Zhang Cheng. Both he and Ernyo gave me kind, welcoming looks. They were just kids from small villages, their hearts still pure and untainted. They were genuinely happy to have a new brother. Jean's lecture that day was brief and dismissive. As the deadline approached, he clearly stopped caring about the rest of the recruits. He only spoke for half an hour, and that was only because of my success. Lately, he'd been finishing in 15 minutes. He had given up on the others. "Songwon, come with me," Jean said, turning toward his private building at the foot of the mountain. I stood up, following behind Zhang Cheng and the frail, aging Ernyo. We walked toward the private chambers, leaving the doomed recruits behind. I felt the envious stares of 100 recruits burning into my back as I walked away. To them, I had just hit the lottery. I followed behind Jean, keeping my head low. I whispered to Zhang Cheng and Ernyo, asking them to look after me now that we were brothers. They nodded, their faces kind and welcoming. We reached the small wooden building at the base of the mountain. It was a simple structure, but it felt like a cage. Jean pointed to an empty room on the first floor and told me it was mine. He instructed me to practice hard and said I could ask him questions anytime. Then, he turned to Ernyo. He told the boy to follow him to the second floor. The first floor was for disciples. The second floor was Jean's private sanctum. No one was allowed up there without an explicit invitation. We all bowed as Ernyo followed the master upstairs. Zhang Cheng led me to my room. It was situated right next to the staircase. My mind was racing with questions about Jean's habits and his daily routine. I needed to know everything if I wanted to escape this place alive. But I kept my mouth shut. The house was made of wood, and the walls were paper thin. Jean was a cultivator with senses far beyond a normal man. One wrong word and he would hear me. Besides, I didn't know if I could trust Zhang Cheng. If he was a loyalist, he'd report me in a heartbeat. I decided to play it safe. I needed to wait for Ernyo. He was simple-minded. He had been here the longest, and I had seen how sickly he looked just a few days ago. He was the key. I asked Zhang Cheng about the fields outside the house. He told me they were spirit herbs used to boost cultivation. I asked about the cave I had seen near the mountain's base. He warned me that it was Jean's alchemy cave. His tone was serious. The second floor, the herb garden, and the cave were all strictly forbidden. I thanked him profusely, acting like the humble, obedient student he expected me to be. I needed to build this persona. I needed them to think I was harmless. Once Zhang Cheng left, I threw myself into my practice. I didn't waste a single second. 3 days passed in a blur. The 1-month deadline for the recruits had finally arrived. On that morning, I stepped out of my room, heading toward the training area for the daily lecture. Ernyo stopped me. He told me the master said we didn't need to go to the morning classes anymore. I narrowed my eyes and looked toward the recruits' quarters in the distance. Usually, the area was buzzing with activity. Today, it was silent. Not a single person was in sight. Ernyo noticed my confusion. He told me the master had sent them all away. Since they couldn't sense energy, there was no point in them staying. A cold shiver raced down my spine and settled in my gut. I knew better. Those boys weren't sent home. They were likely dead, their bodies disposed of to keep the master's secrets. 100 lives snuffed out just like that. I forced a smile and thanked Ernyo for the heads up. I felt sick to my stomach. The air in the house felt heavy and suffocating. I needed to get away from Jean, even if it was just for a few minutes. I suggested a walk in the courtyard. Ernyo agreed, saying he was bored from spending so much time in cultivation. We walked away from the wooden building, and I started asking him about his life. He was a simple boy from a tiny village. His family was poor, surviving on a small plot of land and whatever his father could hunt. He was the oldest of 5. He had only learned to read because a local teacher took pity on him. He was a good person, driven by a desire to help his parents. When we were far enough from the house that I felt safe, I changed the subject. I asked him about his cultivation progress. He hesitated for a second, then leaned in close. He whispered that he was already at the late stage of the first level of qi refining. I stared at him, genuinely shocked. I knew my talent was better than his, yet I wasn't even at the middle stage. It didn't make sense. I asked him how he had moved so fast. Ernyo looked around nervously before answering. He told me the master had given him a special pill called a blood qi pill. It was designed to skyrocket a cultivator's progress. He had only taken one, and it had pushed him straight to the late stage. I whispered the name of the pill to myself. I remembered how ancient and frail he had looked 3 days ago. I asked him if there were any side effects. He admitted that his blood energy had plummeted immediately after taking it. He said he felt like he had aged 50 years in a single night. But then he smiled, telling me the master had given him supplements to fix it. He felt fine now. He was convinced Jean was a savior. He was already dreaming of becoming a high-ranking member of the Heavenly Shark Gang, so he could send money home. I looked at him, and my heart sank. He looked healthy on the outside, but I wasn't a doctor. I couldn't see what that pill had done to his internal organs. If the pill was so great, why didn't Jean take it himself? Why give it to a village boy? The truth hit me like a physical blow. Jean wasn't teaching us. He was using us. We were lab rats for his experimental drugs. The disciples who came before us didn't move on to better things. They died in this house, their bodies used up until they were no longer useful. I wasn't a student. I was a sacrifice. The truth about Jean's disciples finally clicked. It explained why he kept recruiting, why the previous groups vanished, and why the Heavenly Shark Gang members looked at us with such pity. I felt a cold surge of panic. Song 1, my current identity, was in serious danger. Ernyo had been forced to test that pill only 20 days after sensing energy. That meant my clock was ticking. I didn't have much time left. My only hope was that Ernyo and Zhang Cheng could survive long enough to keep Jean occupied while I found a way to escape. I returned to the small building, but I couldn't just sit and wait for death. I needed to act. I had to map out Jean's schedule and find a weakness in his routine. For the last 3 days, he had stayed on the second floor. I didn't know what he was doing, if he slept, or when he was most vulnerable. I stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to the second floor. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart and started walking up. Master, are you in there? I called out softly. Your disciple has hit a wall in his cultivation. I was hoping for some guidance. As I spoke, I used the height of the second floor to scan my surroundings. The building was tucked against a mountain. To the west was a sheer cliff, dozens of feet high and completely bare. No plants, no handholds. Above that was a massive peak covered in thick forest. The other 3 sides of the building were enclosed by high walls guarded by sentries. Even if I got over the walls, I'd still be in the heart of the Heavenly Shark Gang's territory. The only real way out was over that mountain. Come in. Jean's raspy voice broke my concentration. I pushed the door open. Jean was sitting on a prayer mat, leafing through an old book. I kept my eyes down, walked toward him, and bowed deeply. Greetings, Master. He nodded. Sit. Tell me, what is troubling you? Master, my progress has been so slow lately. I feel stuck. I wanted to ask if there's a better way to practice. Where exactly do you feel the blockage? He asked. When the spiritual energy enters my meridians and heads toward my dantian, only a tiny bit stays. Most of it just dissipates. This wasn't a lie. It was a genuine problem I had noticed during my secret sessions. Jean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he quizzed me on my understanding of how energy moves through the body. We talked for nearly an hour. Under his explanation, I actually realized where I had been going wrong. As I prepared to leave, my eyes drifted to the book in his lap. I was sitting directly across from him, so I could clearly see the title, Detailed Guide to Cultivating Low-Level Spiritual Herbs. It looked old and tattered, maybe only a few dozen pages long. Jean caught me looking. Interested in this? My heart skipped a beat. I was terrified he'd realize I was spying on him. But Jean didn't seem suspicious. He looked at me with indifference and tossed the book over. If you want to look, then look. I caught it and opened a page. It was a description of a plant called blood red vine. There was a detailed drawing of a winding creeper. The text said it loved warmth and light, but hated water and cold. What do you think about growing this blood red vine? Jean asked suddenly. Back in my old life, I worked in sales for a Chinese herbal medicine company. I actually knew a thing or two about plants. I decided to use that knowledge. If I could prove I was useful for something other than a lab rat, maybe he wouldn't kill me. I think it should be planted on a sunny slope, far from water, I said confidently. The soil needs to be loose and sandy, so it drains well after rain. And since our winters here are freezing, we'd need to find a way to keep it warm. Jean's eyes brightened. He nodded slowly. I didn't think much of your cultivation talent, but you seem to have a gift for spiritual plants. He went quiet, lost in thought. I didn't know it then, But Jean had been stuck at the third level of chi refining for years. The first 3 levels are just the beginning. You're barely different from a normal human. But the 4th level changes everything. Jean was desperate. He had a manual for the longevity art, a technique famous for one thing: life extension. Most cultivators live to maybe 120. But there were stories of people using this art to live to 180. Jean wanted that extra time. He believed that if he could just hit the 4th level, he could live long enough to reach the late stages of cultivation. The blood chi pill was his shortcut. It was a dangerous drug used by desperate cultivators to break through bottlenecks. Jean had spent 2 years teaching himself how to make it, but he was a hack. He was a former village pharmacist who had stumbled upon a dead cultivator's cave. He didn't really know what he was doing. The pills he made didn't look like the descriptions in his books. He was too scared to take them himself, so he used us. 7 disciples had already died. Their organs had withered, and they had aged decades in a matter of days. Ernio was the first one who hadn't died instantly. That gave Jean hope. He was so close to perfecting the pill that he didn't want to waste time gardening anymore. He looked at me and saw a perfect tool. He didn't just need a sacrifice, he needed a gardener. Jean stood there for a moment, thinking. Then he reached into his robe and pulled out a small, worn-out booklet. He tossed it to me. It was a collection of his own personal notes on how to grow spiritual plants. He told me to study it carefully. Starting today, I was in charge of the eastern field. He promised that if I did a good job, he'd give me the entire plantation to manage in 2 weeks. He even promised me a great reward. I knew better. To Jean, the reward was probably just letting me live a few years longer. The plants in the western field were things like red mustard and salt flour, supplements for his blood chi pills. They weren't rare. You could find them in the mountains around Yin City. Giving them to me was a low-risk move for him. I took the booklet, bowed low, and thanked him. I told him I wouldn't let him down. Back in my room, I compared Jean's notes with the more detailed manual I already had. Jean only grew 8 types of plants, all specifically for his pills. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing everything, building a theoretical foundation for how to keep these things alive. If I could make myself indispensable as a gardener, maybe I could delay the day he forced me to swallow one of his failed experiments. The eastern field was small, about half an acre. Jean had kept it in good shape. I spent my days meticulously checking each plant, numbering them, and recording their growth and water needs in a log. I even pulled the tiny weeds by hand. 10 days later, Jean was impressed enough to hand over the entire field to me. He was going back into seclusion to refine a new batch of pills. Before he shut the heavy stone door of his alchemy cave, he pulled me aside. He was obsessed with one specific plant, the red blood vine. It was the core ingredient for the pills and incredibly hard to find. He had used the entire power of the Heaven Slayer gang to search the country just to find this 150-year-old vine. He only ever took small clippings from it, terrified he might kill it. From what Ernio told me, Jean usually stayed in his cave for at least 10 days when refining. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was my chance to escape. I slipped into the small wooden tool shed in the middle of the fields. I tore the place apart looking for anything useful, a rope, a map, anything. All I found were standard farming tools until I spotted a 20-centimeter dagger hidden in a corner. It had a black blade that seemed to swallow the light. I tested it on a thick wooden post. It sliced through like it was cutting air. I slid the dagger into its leather sheath and tucked it firmly into my boot. I walked back out to the fields with a hoe over my shoulder, trying to look busy. My eyes kept darting to the cliffs. The shortest drop was about 15 meters, the tallest over 30. The rock was slick with wet moss and completely bare of trees or handholds. I didn't have a rope, and building a ladder would be too loud and obvious. Ernio and Zhang Cheng were too loyal to Jean to help me. If I asked them to join me, they'd probably turn me in. I felt a surge of panic. I had the opportunity, but the terrain was a prison. My hand slipped, and my hoe nearly chopped a spiritual plant in half. I stopped and took a deep breath. I had to be patient. I couldn't afford to be reckless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I crept out of my room and looked up at the moonlit cliffs. My heart sank. High up on the peak, I saw the flickering glow of a campfire. There were guards up there. It made sense. The Heaven Slayer gang wouldn't leave their perimeter unguarded. They had scouts and warriors everywhere. Even if I climbed the cliff, I'd be walking right into a sentry post. With my current strength, I wouldn't stand a chance against trained killers. I went back to my room, defeated. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat cross-legged and practiced the longevity art. If I couldn't outrun them, I had to be strong enough to fight them. By the time 10 days had passed, my hard work paid off. I had reached the mid-stage of the first level of chi refining. Then, the stone door to the alchemy cave creaked open. Jean walked out, looking triumphant. He had a look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He checked the fields, gave me a fake smile, and told me I was doing a good job. He was in a hurry. He had managed to refine 2 pills in a single batch, a personal best. He actually believed he had finally perfected the recipe. "Ernyo, Zhangcheng," Jean shouted, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "Come to the 2nd floor. I have something special for you." I watched them go, my stomach turning. The next round of testing had begun. Jean didn't wait for a response. He turned and headed straight for the 2nd floor. Zhangcheng didn't hesitate for a second. He scrambled out of his room, eyes bright with excitement. He was desperate to get up there. Master Jean had been in seclusion for so long, and now, the moment he emerged, he called for his disciples. Zhangcheng was convinced he was about to receive a miracle pill to boost his power. Jean had promised him that once he reached the 2nd level of chi refining, he'd get a vacation to visit his family. He imagined himself returning home as a core member of the Heaven Slayer gang, pockets full of silver, basking in the envy of his neighbors. He wanted to bring honor to his ancestors. With those thoughts fueling him, he quickened his pace and disappeared upstairs. Ernyo was slower. When he opened his door, his face was tight with hesitation. He hadn't forgotten what happened the last time he took one of those pills. It had made him stronger, sure, but it had nearly killed him. He had spent days wondering if he'd even survive the week. He never expected to be forced to take another blood chi pill so soon. He really didn't want to swallow it. But Ernyo was an honest, simple soul. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that the master who changed his life would actually try to kill him. Eventually, he sighed and followed Zhangcheng up the stairs. Inside the room, Jean held out 2 dark spheres. He told them these pills would skyrocket their cultivation. He ordered them to swallow the pills immediately and sit right there so he could protect their meridians while they refined the energy. "Thank you, Master," Zhangcheng cried out, his voice full of gratitude. He popped the pill into his mouth without a second thought. Ernyo hesitated for a heartbeat, but he lacked the courage to question Jean. He swallowed his pill too. Moments later, white steam began to rise from their heads. Their faces twisted in pure agony. "Hold on," Jean barked. "Keep circulating your energy. If you stop now, it's all for nothing. You won't just lose the progress, you'll destroy your cultivation." The 2 boys gritted their teeth and endured. Their body temperatures soared. Their skin turned a violent, angry red, like shrimp being boiled alive. Jean watched them, but his expression wasn't one of concern, it was unease. Suddenly, Ernyo let out a blood-curdling scream. His head snapped back, and he collapsed, his body twitching violently on the floor. Zhangcheng fell a second later, hitting the floor hard, unconscious. "How can this be?" Jean muttered, his face pale with frustration. He could feel the spiritual energy inside them going wild, but their life force, their blood chi, was being drained at a terrifying rate. The pills were working just like the old ones, trading their very lives for a temporary burst of power. But this time, the drain was even faster. Even though they were unconscious, the pills didn't stop. Their blood chi continued to convert into spiritual energy, but since they weren't conscious to control it, the energy just leaked out of their bodies, slightly raising the spiritual concentration in the room. I watched from below as the boys withered before my eyes. Their skin sagged and wrinkles crawled across their limbs. Ernyo, who had taken the pills twice now, started looking like a frail old man. Their breathing grew faint, and they were dying. Jean's face was twisted in rage. He had failed again. Worse, he had lost 2 test subjects at once. He muttered to himself that he should have only used one. He shook off the disappointment, his eyes turning cold and predatory. He decided then and there that he'd have to use the boy outside next. He had wanted to let me live a bit longer, but fate had other plans. He realized he needed to put recruiting new subjects back on his schedule. He couldn't afford to run out of bodies again. Jean opened the door and walked out, not even glancing at the two boys twitching on the floor behind him. I was looking up at the balcony when our eyes met. My heart nearly stopped. It felt like being stared down by a starving predator. I felt like I was about to be swallowed whole. I knew right then, the experiment had failed. I was next. I forced myself to look away and went back to my work in the fields, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. But inside, I was trembling. All day, I kept one eye on that second floor. I prayed to see Ernyo or Zhang Cheng walk down those stairs alive. But the hours passed in silence. At dusk, two thugs from the Heaven Slayer gang marched upstairs. A few minutes later, they came back down, each carrying a heavy burlap sack over their shoulders. They left the courtyard without a word. My stomach dropped. They were dead, and I was the only one left. I didn't sleep that night. I lost track of how many nights I'd spent staring at the ceiling in fear. The next morning, Jean found me. He told me he was going back into seclusion to refine more pills and warned me to take perfect care of the herb garden. As I watched him walk away, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. Jean would be busy for 10 days. This was my last chance to escape. I couldn't sit around and wait for death anymore. I went to the tool shed and grabbed a machete. I found 4 small trees near the back wall, hidden from the main view. My plan was simple. Wait for nightfall, chop them down, and lash them together to make a ladder to scale the cliffs. I was stronger and faster now thanks to the longevity art. I actually had a chance. I waited for the sun to go down, counting the minutes. But just as the shadows grew long, 4 gang members marched into the courtyard. They moved into the small building, and 2 of them took up positions right outside my door. I stood in my room, frozen. Did Jean know? Had I slipped up? It didn't make sense. I had been so careful. I paced the floor, my mind racing with anxiety. I couldn't understand how he'd found out. In reality, Jean didn't know about my escape plan. He was just a paranoid man. He didn't want me sneaking onto the second floor to steal his secrets while he was busy. But his paranoia had effectively caged me. The next few days were a blur of terror. Every time I thought about making a break for it, risking the guards' blades to climb the cliff, I saw their steel swords and remembered I wasn't a warrior yet. Then, the courtyard got noisy again. I watched from my window as more young men were dragged into the side rooms and locked away. Jean was restocking. He was getting ready for his next batch, and I knew I was at the top of the list. 10 days passed. Jean finally emerged from his secluded meditation. He looked radiant, clearly confident in the batch of pills he had just finished refining. Songwon, come with me to the second floor. Jean's voice hit me like a physical blow. My face went pale. I didn't know how to resist. Ever since I arrived at the Black Fiend gang, I felt like meat on a chopping block, waiting for the knife to fall. I hesitated for a long time, but eventually I followed him up the stairs. Eat this, Jean said, holding out a pill. It will boost your cultivation significantly. Once you reach the second level, you'll become a core member of the gang. You'll be free to come and go as you please. His voice was full of temptation, but I wasn't a fool. The situation was life-threatening. I couldn't keep up my act of being a submissive student anymore. I glared at him, wanting nothing more than to smash my fist into his smiling face. But I knew I was no match for him. If I angered him, he would use one of those yellow talismans on me. I'd end up like that chubby boy, turned into a pile of ash in seconds. Weakness is the ultimate sin. In that moment, I understood that truth more clearly than ever. Jean's smile turned into a cold sneer. I didn't expect to have a smart one among my disciples, he said. It seems you've guessed the truth. But don't try to resist. Swallow the pill. If you survive, I will truly give you your freedom. He tossed a small token onto the floor. It was the size of a baby's palm. This is my personal command token, he continued. With this, you can go anywhere in the gang's territory. I looked at the token, then at the pill in his hand. I was trapped. I took the pill and picked up the token. I hope you keep your word, master, I muttered. I had no strength to fight, so I had to gamble on luck. Ernyo had survived his first trial, so maybe I could too. Jean nodded. I always keep my word. You've seen the new recruits. If you survive this, I won't need you for testing anymore. You'll just help me tend the medicinal gardens. I didn't believe him for a second. He'd just find another excuse to use me once he ran out of test subjects. If I survived this, I had to find a way out. I sat cross-legged on the floor and swallowed the pill. It turned into a wave of searing heat that surged through my body. My temperature skyrocketed. The heat flowed through my meridians, but at the same time, it began to drain my essence and blood. My face turned deathly pale. I could feel the longevity art working, refining the heat into spiritual energy and storing it in my dantian. But the cost was immense. I felt incredibly weak, as if I'd been physically drained by dozens of people at once. I could barely stay seated. I wanted to just lie down and sleep. Don't lie down. Jean's voice hissed in my ear. If you stop now, the medicine will consume your blood and kill you even faster. I had no choice but to trust him. I gritted my teeth and pushed on. Just as I felt my blood essence was about to run dry, a mysterious surge of energy suddenly appeared from deep within me. It was unannounced and powerful, as if some hidden trait in my body had been triggered by the extreme pressure. I used this new energy to finish refining the pill. Jean watched me, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. Unlike the others, I wasn't aging rapidly. I was surviving. Half an hour later, I opened my eyes, exhausted. Before I could even breathe, Jean's hand moved. He shoved a black pill into my mouth. Don't worry, he said calmly. That's a 7-day heartbreaking pill. As long as you take the antidote every 7 days, it won't hurt you. I was too weak to fight back. The deed was done. I was now under his complete control. I managed to stand up and lean against the wall as I shuffled back to my room. My legs were shaking uncontrollably. I felt hollowed out. Once I hit the bed, I thought about that mysterious energy. It was the only reason I hadn't ended up like Ernio or Zhang Cheng. I searched my body for it, but it was gone, completely spent. Over the next 2 days, my treatment changed. I was fed expensive herbs like ginseng and soups meant to replenish my blood. By the 3rd morning, I felt mostly recovered, though my back still felt a bit weak. I decided to use the token. I had been trapped in this courtyard for 2 months. It was time to see the world outside. As I headed for the gate, I saw 100 new boys and girls gathered in the courtyard. I felt a pang of pity. This world really had no regard for human life. Songwon, where are you going? I froze. It was Jean. He was about to start his lecture for the new recruits. I turned around and bowed respectfully. Master, I was planning to take a walk outside. Jean nodded with a fake, kind smile. Good. Go clear your head. He turned to the crowd of frightened teenagers. Everyone, look at Songwon. He is my eldest disciple. He has studied with me for 2 months. If you work hard, you can be like him. You will learn immortal arts and gain wealth and status beyond your dreams. The crowd looked inspired, their blood pumping with excitement. I just felt disgusted. I was being used as a prop to lure them to their deaths. Come, Jean said, gesturing to me. Say a few words to your new brothers and sisters. I didn't want to do it. Every fiber of my being recoiled at the thought of helping Jean, but my life was on the line. I couldn't afford to defy him openly. I forced a warm, enthusiastic smile onto my face and turned to the new recruits. I told them to follow the master with everything they had. I told them that sensing spiritual energy was like a carp leaping through the dragon's gate to become a dragon. I called it a blessing they had earned through 100 lifetimes of good karma. I told them this was their only chance to change their destinies. Inside, I was screaming apologies. I felt sick. But the cold reality was simple. If they succeeded quickly, Jean would have fresh blood to drain. That meant he might leave me alone for a little longer. Jean nodded, looking satisfied with my performance. He told me I had done well. He handed me a token and said I could withdraw 500 silver taels every month from the treasury. I bowed low, thanked him, and got out of there as fast as I could. With that token in my hand, nobody stopped me. The guards and disciples I passed even looked at me with newfound respect. I found my way to the Tiansha sect's treasury. I wasn't about to save them any money. I withdrew the maximum amount, 400 tael notes, 9 10-tael notes, and 10 taels in loose silver. In this country, 500 taels was a fortune. A family of 3 could live comfortably for a month on just 1 tael. With my pockets heavy, I walked out of the Tiansha sect gates with a lighter step. The streets of Yen City were a chaotic mess of people and noise. I wandered through the crowds, buying street food as I went. Since I started practicing the longevity art, my appetite had become massive. I stopped to watch street performers and jugglers, things I had never seen back in my old world. When they did something impressive, I tossed them some loose silver. They worked even harder after that. I spent the whole morning wandering. I covered half the city, looking like a typical tourist. But while I was eating snacks and watching shows, I was actually scouting. I was memorizing the locations of every major medical clinic in the city. I was also checking for tails. Gene had let me out far too easily, and I was terrified he had someone following me. By noon, I was certain I wasn't being followed. That realization actually made me feel worse. If Gene didn't care that I was wandering free, it meant he was absolutely confident I couldn't escape his grasp. The 7-day heartbreaking pill was likely impossible to cure. I walked into a clinic called Xinglin Hall. I had heard about the doctor here, an old man named Shui Tao. People called him a miracle worker for difficult diseases, but he was also incredibly greedy. I had to pay 10 taels of silver just to see him, with no guarantee of a cure. I sat down and told him straight out that I had been poisoned. He nodded and told me to give him my left hand. He checked my pulse, his brow furrowed. Then he checked my right hand. He looked at my tongue and the whites of my eyes. He sighed and told me that my blood and essence were severely depleted, likely from recent physical strain. But as for poison, he couldn't find a single trace of it in my system. I felt a wave of disappointment. I begged him to look again, insisting I had been poisoned. He just shook his head. He told me he'd been a doctor for decades and had treated countless poisonings, but I looked clean to him. If I really was poisoned, he said, it was beyond his skill. I visited 5 more clinics after that. Every single doctor told me the same thing. No trace of poison. No way to help. My heart sank. It seemed the doctors of the mundane world were useless against Gene's methods. If I wanted a cure, I had to look elsewhere. Gene had mentioned before that the poison came from within the Tiansha sect itself. If the cure existed, it was hidden right under my nose.